Welcome to Last Moments. I'm Timothy. Join me as I uncover the most insane Karen deaths ever recorded, from a woman who walked into a clinic knowing something was wrong, to a Karen who ignored a literal typhoon evacuation just to save her designer luggage. It was March 4th, 2016, and Columbus sat under a flat, gray, early spring sky. Temperatures hovered in the low 40s, that damp, stubborn cold that lingers after winter. Traffic was building into the afternoon rush, lanes filling, signals cycling. Nothing unusual. On paper, it was routine. The danger didn't come from the road. It came from a decision shaped by refusal rather than uncertainty, one that began before the car ever moved. Davenquish was 50 and carried herself like someone who believed she was the exception. Office management had trained her to keep things moving, override problems, and stay in control. People described her as dismissive, someone who minimized concerns and treated caution as unnecessary interruption. Slowing down wasn't just inconvenient to her. It was something she resisted, even when the situation clearly demanded it. That pattern worked in controlled environments. Here, it didn't. That afternoon, she went to a clinic because her body forced the issue. Slurred speech, dizziness, and a severe headache. Clear signs of a stroke in progress, serious enough to interrupt her day. The staff were direct. She should not drive and needed immediate care. Her response wasn't uncertainty, it was dismissal. Documentation showed she minimized her symptoms and rejected further care, prioritizing continuation of her day over the risk already unfolding. The clinic recorded the warning and her decision, creating a clear point where the outcome could have changed. She left anyway. In the parking lot, a bystander noticed something was wrong and tried to intervene. Her condition was visible now: slowed movement, disorientation, the kind of situation that makes strangers step in. She ignored it, got into the car, and drove, continuing as if nothing required her to stop, as if the problem would resolve itself through motion alone. This is where it shifts from frustrating to dangerous. She wasn't just deciding for herself anymore, she was extending that risk to everyone on the road. She entered a multi-lane road as traffic thickened, and within moments, the issue was visible. The car drifted, corrected late, then drifted again. Speed fluctuated without reason. It wasn't aggressive, it was unpredictable. Drivers around her created distance, reacting to something they couldn't fully identify but immediately recognized as unsafe. Inside the vehicle, the stroke was progressing. Blood flow to critical areas of the brain was being restricted in real time. Motor control weakened. Reaction time slowed. Awareness slipped. And despite multiple opportunities to stop earlier, she remained behind the wheel, still in motion, while her ability to control it was actively deteriorating, each second narrowing the margin for recovery. There was no dramatic moment, just a gradual loss of control. The vehicle drifted once more, then slowed to a stop in the lane, engine still running. Traffic moved carefully around it as emergency calls came in. She was found unresponsive in the driver's seat, the vehicle becoming still only after she no longer could continue. What stands out is how many points existed to prevent this. The clinic warned her. A bystander intervened. Drivers recognized it. Every signal was there, and each one was dismissed through action, one after another, until there were no more chances left to take. She was transported to a hospital and later pronounced dead due to complications from the stroke that had already begun before she left the clinic. Investigators confirmed she had been advised not to drive and chose to ignore it. No collision occurred. The incident was classified as a fatal medical emergency while driving, with the critical decisions happening well before the final moment. There was no hidden hazard here, just a progression of decisions where caution was overridden until control was gone and nothing remained to correct it.
It was March 4th, 2018, a cool early spring evening in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where most of the restaurants close by 9 and everyone knows which diner has the best pie. This particular spot was a little family-run place off a 2-lane road. Nothing fancy. Checkered tablecloths, a handwritten specials board, maybe 15 tables total, the kind of diner where the staff remembers your order if you come in twice. Paula Dwan was 45 years old. She worked as a cashier at a shop in town and was the type of mother who turned small outings into events. Dinner at the diner wasn't just dinner. It was her and her teenage daughter catching up, talking about school, picking apart the menu like it was a five-star restaurant. That evening, the two of them sat down for what was supposed to be exactly that, a normal weeknight meal. Now here's where I need you to pay attention, because what happened next wasn't sudden, it was slow, and every step of it was avoidable. Paula had a peanut allergy. She knew about it. She'd had it for years. When she sat down, she mentioned it to the server, but according to staff statements taken afterward, she downplayed it. She told them small amounts were usually fine. The server flagged it anyway and let her know the dessert she was looking at contained ground peanuts. Not traces, ground peanuts, baked directly into it. The staff offered to bring her something else. Paula declined. She insisted it would be fine, and she wasn't carrying any allergy medication with her. No emergency kit, no backup plan, just confidence that it had never been that bad before, so it probably wouldn't be that bad now. She ate the dessert. Several minutes later, still seated at the table with her daughter, she started coughing. A persistent, dry one, the kind you try to clear with a sip of water. Then the redness started showing, around her face first, then spreading down her neck. Her daughter noticed. The staff noticed. Breathing became visibly harder, that tight, labored sound that tells you the airway is narrowing. The staff offered to call emergency services right away, and this is the part that's hardest for me to sit with. Paula hesitated. She delayed the call. Maybe she thought it would pass. Maybe she didn't want to make a scene in front of her daughter. But those minutes mattered, and they were spent waiting instead of acting. By the time the situation became undeniable, she collapsed near the table. Her body had moved into full anaphylactic shock, and without medication to slow it down, there was nothing anyone in that diner could do. The ambulance arrived roughly 6 minutes after the call was finally made. Paula was pronounced dead at the hospital. The official cause was listed as a severe allergic reaction. Anaphylaxis triggered by a known allergen she had been explicitly warned about in a food she chose to eat, without carrying the one thing that might have bought her enough time. The health inspection that followed found no violations. The staff had identified the allergen, communicated it clearly, and offered an alternative. Every box was checked on their end. And honestly, that's the detail that sits with me the heaviest, is that everyone in that diner did exactly what they were supposed to do, and it still wasn't enough to save her from herself. And I think that's what makes Paula's story land differently. There was no reckless driver, no unstable ground. There was a woman who knew she had an allergy, heard the warning out loud from someone standing right in front of her, and decided it didn't apply this time. And her daughter was sitting across the table for all of it. I keep coming back to the delay, not the dessert, not even the missing medication. The moment where help was offered and the answer was not yet. That gap, those few minutes between the first cough and the 911 call, that's where the outcome was probably decided.
It was September 8th, 2015, and the ship had docked at Belize City just after 7 a.m. The cave system was several miles inland, reached by a 40-minute bus ride and a hike through dense jungle. The tour route ran about 1,100 feet into the cave, narrow in some sections, wide open in others. No natural light passed the first chamber, and humid enough that you were sweating the whole way through, regardless of the 72 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. Claudette Charles was 58, a property manager from Memphis, Tennessee, on a 9-day cruise with her husband, who had skipped the excursion in favor of staying on the ship. She had been managing mild hypertension for several years and took a low-dose diuretic every morning as part of that. The previous evening, she had started feeling nauseous and had been up most of the night with loose stools and vomiting. She told her husband it was probably something she ate at dinner and that she would be fine by morning. By morning, she was not fine, but a little vomiting was apparently not enough to change her plans. That morning, the ship had posted a norovirus advisory in common areas and at the excursion desk, asking anyone with stomach symptoms to skip group shore activities for the day. Claudette walked past it on her way to the bus. The excursion launched around 8:30 a.m. with a group of about 14 passengers. At the staging area, the guide asked if anyone was feeling unwell, standard protocol given the advisory posted that morning. Claudette said she hadn't paid good money to be turned away at the door over a little nausea. On the bus ride to the cave, she vomited once into a bag she had brought, told the passenger next to her it was motion sickness, and wiped her mouth.
At the cave entrance, the guide looked at her and asked if she was all right. She was pale and had already sweated through the back of her shirt on the walk from the bus. She told him she just needed a minute and that she was fine. He offered to let her wait at the entrance with the bus driver. She said she hadn't come all this way to sit outside. He gave her an extra water bottle, kept her in his line of sight, and the group moved in. By the halfway point, she had drifted to the back and was visibly struggling to keep pace. Another tourist walking near her asked if she needed to stop. She shook her head and kept moving. She was drinking from the water bottle, but not nearly enough given how much she had already lost since the night before. At around 950 feet into the cave, the guide paused the group in a wide chamber he used as a standard rest point. Claudette sat down on a rock formation without being asked. The guide crouched beside her and could see her skin was clammy, her lips dry and cracked, and her hands were shaking. He handed her water and told the group they were taking 5 minutes. She drank slowly. When he signaled the group to move on, she stood up, took 2 steps, and went down sideways without stumbling or reaching out to catch herself. She just dropped and hit the cave floor without bracing herself at all. A tourist with basic first aid training knelt beside her and found a pulse that was weak and irregular. She was breathing but shallowly and did not respond to her name. The guide's radio signal was poor at that depth, so he sent the strongest member of the group running back toward the entrance on foot while he and the tourist began CPR after her pulse disappeared approximately 8 minutes after she fell. It took the runner 22 minutes to reach the entrance and another 19 minutes for emergency responders to get to her location inside the cave with a stretcher. They couldn't bring her back. She was carried out and transported to a regional medical facility. Her husband was reached by the ship's guest services team while the ship was still docked at Belize City. He was taken to the facility by port staff. Resuscitation efforts continued at the facility before she was pronounced dead. He was the one who identified her. The post-mortem blood work showed severely depleted potassium and signs of significant dehydration throughout. The terminal event was ventricular fibrillation, the heart losing its rhythm and not getting it back. The coroner's report connected the dots. Years of daily diuretic use had kept her potassium quietly on the low end. The stomach illness drained what was left overnight, and a morning of hiking through a humid cave finished it off. Her husband confirmed she had been sick the night before and that he had told her to stay on the ship. The guide's records showed he had flagged her twice and offered her the option to wait at the entrance. The excursion operator was not found liable.
It was April 14th, 2016. The afternoon sun hung over a neighborhood dog park in South Austin, Texas, casting long shadows across the fenced enclosure where families gathered with their pets. Margaret Lee, 58, had no children of her own. Her family said that after her divorce 8 years earlier, she had channeled all her maternal instincts into Prince, whom she had raised from a puppy. Co-workers described her as defensive and confrontational, particularly when anyone questioned her dog handling practices. She had been cited twice by animal control for off-leash violations, but dismissed the warnings as overreach by bureaucrats who did not understand proper animal behavior. Friends said that Margaret frequently posted on social media groups for pit bull owners, defending the breed against what she called unfair stereotypes, while simultaneously documenting Prince's aggressive responses to perceived threats. That afternoon, the park was busier than usual. Several families with young children occupied the grassy area adjacent to the dog enclosure. A father in his early 30s had brought his 3-year-old daughter to watch the dogs from a safe distance. Margaret unleashed Prince immediately upon entering, ignoring the posted signs and verbal warnings from nearby dog owners. When approached by the father, who politely asked her to restrain her dog near the children, Margaret responded that Prince was perfectly trained and posed no danger to anyone. Prince initially appeared calm, sniffing the ground and exploring the perimeter. His body was rigid, a low rumble vibrating in his throat, and he moved forward without the typical sniff and turn most dogs show. Within minutes, the dog approached the toddler, who had wandered closer to the fence line. The father moved to block Prince's approach, and when the dog lunged at the child with bared teeth, showing stiff posture, forward ears, and raised hackles, the father instinctively kicked at the animal to protect his daughter. The kick struck Prince in the shoulder, causing the dog to yelp and temporarily retreat rather than escalating. Margaret witnessed this from across the park and ran toward the father, screaming that he had assaulted her dog. Witnesses reported that she shoved the man with both hands, nearly knocking him over. Before anyone could intervene, Margaret pulled a canister of pepper spray from her jacket pocket and aimed it at the father's face. A sudden shifting gust funneled the spray back into her face at point-blank range. The concentrated capsaicin caused immediate blindness and respiratory distress. She dropped the canister and clawed frantically at her burning eyes, her vision completely obscured. The spray left her disoriented, coughing, and functionally blind. Disoriented and panicking, she stumbled backward through the park gate, which someone had left open during the commotion. Margaret staggered blindly toward the street, her hands still covering her face. Multiple witnesses shouted warnings, but she could not orient herself. She reached the curb and stepped directly into the path of a city bus, traveling approximately 40 miles per hour on the adjacent road. The arterial road offered no crosswalk near the gate, and shrubs along the sidewalk partially obscured the driver's view. The driver had no time to brake. The impact threw Margaret's body nearly 25 feet. A bystander called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, but Margaret had died on impact. The medical examiner's report documented multiple blunt force trauma injuries, including severe skull fractures and catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. The ME noted trace amounts of capsaicin in the ocular tissue consistent with recent exposure. Prince was impounded by animal control for a standard 10-day rabies observation, while the city initiated a dangerous dog review. Margaret's estate became the subject of potential civil claims following the incident, and the father later pursued charges related to the assault and pepper spray escalation.
It was March 14th, 2013. The sandstone walls of Wadi Rum stood tall and close, their surfaces worn smooth by wind and time. The air was dry, the sky clear, and the canyon floor stretched narrow between the rock faces, quiet, except for the low hum of passing vehicles slowly. Claire Donnelly, 45, from Bristol, had spent months saving for this trip, and she made sure it showed. She booked the tour late, made specific requests about seating, and spoke openly about wanting the experience to go her way. From the start, it wasn't just a vacation to her, it was something she expected to control. The tour itself was simple, a guided jeep ride through a canyon led by a local driver named Farhan. The route narrowed in certain sections where the rock walls closed in tightly on both sides. Before entering that stretch, Farhan gave a clear safety briefing. Stay seated, keep your body inside the vehicle, and don't lean out at any point. Claire barely acknowledged it. When he repeated the instructions, she interrupted, questioning why the rules were necessary at such a slow speed. Farhan tried to explain the tight clearances ahead, but she dismissed it, saying she had been on similar tours before and knew what she was doing. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the space tightened. The sandstone walls rose close on both sides, leaving little room between the vehicle and the rock. Claire began shifting in her seat, turning sideways to get a better view, then bracing herself against the frame as she leaned slightly outward. Farhan reminded her again to stay seated, but she responded sharply, insisting she was fine and telling him to just keep driving. When they reached the narrowest section, she pushed it further. Holding the overhead bar, she lifted herself partially out of her seat, leaning her upper body outside the Jeep despite repeated warnings. At that point, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. She wanted a better view, and she wasn't willing to adjust. The Jeep continued at a controlled pace into a gradual right-hand curve, bringing the vehicle closer to the canyon wall. Claire stayed extended outward. Her weight shifted beyond the frame of the Jeep. Farhan called out again for her to sit down, but she pushed back verbally, refusing to move. As the vehicle followed the curve, the clearance narrowed even more. With her body already outside the safe boundary, there was no margin left. The side of the Jeep passed within inches of the rock face, and in that moment, her position left her exposed. Her upper body struck the sandstone wall at speed. The impact was direct and forceful, driving her head and neck sideways against the rock. The force snapped her alignment instantly, causing immediate loss of consciousness. With her grip broken, Her body lost support and dropped from the vehicle as it came to a stop. The Jeep stopped within seconds. Farhan braked immediately and climbed down to reach her, finding her unresponsive. Another guide called for emergency assistance, but the canyon made everything harder. Its narrow layout limited access, and responders had to navigate the same tight route, which took nearly an hour. During that time, there was no change in her condition. When emergency crews arrived, they moved her out of the canyon and transported her to a hospital. But she never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead later that day. The cause was a severe head injury from the impact with the rock, leading to rapid internal bleeding. A review later confirmed she had been standing and leaning outside the vehicle despite clear instructions. The guide was cleared, and the tour operator tightened its safety rules afterward.
It was October 9th, 2015, a Friday morning in Soho, Manhattan. The weather was cold and overcast, with temperatures hovering in the low 50s. Inside a loft building, things were quiet. Most people had already left for work, leaving the hallways nearly empty by mid-morning. This is where Anastasia Pallard lived and worked. Anastasia was 36, and she marketed herself as a high-end wellness expert. She targeted wealthy women in finance, fashion, and media who were willing to pay top dollar for exclusive treatments. Now, here's the thing. She had absolutely zero medical background. She had a business degree, but she was incredibly good at using clinical-sounding buzzwords to make ordinary wellness trends sound like cutting-edge science. Her clients totally bought into it because she sounded like an authority, and her loft looked exactly like a high-tech clinic. To keep her brand looking elite, Anastasia leased a commercial walk-in cryotherapy chamber and set it up right inside her apartment. It became the backdrop for her social media. She live-streamed her sessions constantly. Her follower count was shooting up, and she'd just landed a big supplement sponsorship. That chamber was her entire business. But she made a massive, fatal mistake. The technician who installed the chamber told her flat out to never use the machine without a second person in the room to monitor it, which, to me, is just basic safety that you never ignore. But during one of her live streams, the tech accidentally walked into the frame. Anastasia felt having a worker in the background ruined her solo expert image, so she fired him. She decided she'd just run the machine herself, and she'd already done it twice alone without any issues. That Friday morning, she started up a live stream and stepped inside the chamber. What she didn't know was that the nitrogen supply line had a faulty valve connector. As the session continued, nitrogen began leaking into the loft itself rather than venting safely outside. Because nitrogen displaces oxygen without any smell or warning, the air around the chamber gradually became oxygen deficient. And here is the truly terrifying part about nitrogen. You don't feel like you're suffocating. You don't gasp for air. Instead, your brain just quietly starves, which is the most chilling detail of all, because you would have absolutely no idea it was even happening. Witnesses later said Anastasia suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence and became unusually quiet. Within seconds, her knees appeared to give out, and she slid down against the inside wall of the chamber until she was no longer visible through the viewing panel. At first, most viewers assumed the live stream had frozen or that she had simply stepped out of frame. Hours passed without any new posts, replies, or activity. Several regular clients later said this was unusual because Anastasia normally responded to messages almost immediately. By early afternoon, friends and clients were attempting to contact her directly. When repeated calls and messages went unanswered, concern began spreading among people who followed her closely online. Eventually, one local client who knew where Anastasia lived contacted building management and asked them to perform a welfare check. Building staff attempted to reach Anastasia through the intercom and by phone several times over the next hour. When nobody answered and there was still no sign of activity inside the loft, they contacted emergency services. When firefighters and building security finally entered the apartment, several hours had passed since the live stream had ended. The cryotherapy chamber was still powered on. Investigators later found that the room's oxygen monitoring alarm had been disabled, likely because repeated warnings had become a nuisance during previous sessions. The medical examiner ruled that Anastasia died from hypoxia. Her body had some surface frostbite on her legs and back from collapsing against the freezing walls, but she was already gone before they found her. Her brain had just run out of air. A few weeks later, the state issued a massive safety warning about unsupervised cryotherapy. Anastasia's business page stayed online for a while, with her very last post tragically promoting the exact machine that took her life. It's hard to watch someone disappear on a live stream, and somehow it's just as hard to read about someone who drowned in a parking garage holding onto a box, both of them in the end, alone with something they refused to leave behind.
It was May 15th, 2018, and a quiet residential community built over volcanic terrain was coming apart in a way no one there had ever experienced. Streets had begun to split. Long cracks cut through yards and pavement. In multiple locations, molten rock had already surfaced, slow but unstoppable. The air carried a sharp sulfur sting, the kind that burned the throat and made breathing feel wrong if you stayed in it too long. What started as warnings had escalated into mandatory evacuation orders. Families packed quickly. Cars filled driveways, then disappeared. Within days, the neighborhood emptied out. Zabby Grohl, 61, did not leave. At first, neighbors assumed she just needed more time, but as conditions worsened, her refusal started to stand out. When utility crews came through urging immediate evacuation, she didn't just decline, she pushed back. When officials explained the severity, she reportedly insisted she understood the risks better than they did. She framed it as control, as awareness, as being more capable than the people knocking on her door. She wasn't panicking like everyone else. She wasn't overreacting. This was her property, and she made it clear she wasn't going to be told what to do with it. By the time the last neighbors were leaving, some described a shift, not just attachment, but defiance. She was still outside, moving things around, monitoring the situation herself, acting as if the evacuation was optional guidance meant for other people. The same warnings everyone else heard, she filtered differently. In her mind, this wasn't an emergency she needed to obey. It was an inconvenience she intended to outlast. The ground had been changing for days. Cracks widened across roads and yards. Gas levels fluctuated. The smell in the air wasn't constant. Sometimes it faded just enough to feel manageable, reinforcing the idea that the situation was under control. She continued working outside in that environment, adjusting belongings, staying active, staying present, as if visibility meant safety. Then a new fissure opened nearby. With it came a surge in volcanic gas output, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide pushing up from underground. The terrain wasn't flat or predictable. It dipped, pocketed, and uneven lava formations created natural low points where gases could settle. Carbon dioxide, heavier than air, collected silently in these areas, displacing oxygen without warning. Sulfur dioxide lingered as an irritant, burning, choking, forcing the body into distress. There isn't always smoke. There isn't always a visible cue, and by the time symptoms start, the body is already losing the ability to respond. She was outside when conditions shifted. Exposure at that level doesn't unfold slowly. Carbon dioxide reduces available oxygen, leading to dizziness, confusion, then rapid loss of consciousness. At the same time, sulfur dioxide inflames the lungs, triggering coughing, panic, and impaired breathing. Together, they create a narrowing window, seconds to minutes, where awareness slips before a person fully processes what's happening. There were no witnesses. What investigators later reconstructed came from position, gas measurements, and eruption timelines. She collapsed on her own property. What stays with me isn't just that she stayed, it's how firmly she believed she was the exception. The orders were clear, the risk was visible. People had already proven what the right decision looked like by leaving. But somewhere in that progression, she placed her judgment above all of it. Above officials, above neighbors, above the environment itself. By the time responders could safely return, she was unresponsive. She was found where she had chosen to remain, The cause of death was hazardous gas exposure. Oxygen displacement from carbon dioxide accumulation in a low-lying area compounded by respiratory distress from sulfur dioxide during active fissure emissions. The evacuation order had been documented, the advisories had been repeated, the conditions had been escalating in plain sight. And still, she stayed. Zabby's case changes the way the pattern reads. Every danger before this feels external, something advancing, something you can step away from. But here, the threat didn't need to chase her. It didn't need speed or force. It only required one decision to stand still and believe the rules didn't apply. That's what makes it different. Because the most dangerous factor in that entire environment wasn't just the gas rising from the ground. It was the certainty that she didn't have to listen.
It was May 2016, and the Utah desert was doing what it does best in late spring, baking everything under a sky so blue it almost looked fake. The kind of day where the heat comes off the sandstone in waves and the air smells like dust and dry brush. The state park overlook was busy with families, couples, and hikers making their way along the paved path that ran along the ridge. Becca Vant was 34 years old. She worked in retail, the kind of job where you spend most of your day managing other people's problems with a smile on your face. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't back down easily. She had opinions, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. She was the type of person who would argue with a staff member over a posted policy, not out of cruelty, but because she genuinely believed rules were often made by people who didn't think things through. That personality followed her everywhere. That afternoon, she was at the park with her brother and her 2 kids, a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. The overlook had a view that stretched out over a wide canyon, layers of red and orange rock dropping hundreds of feet below. It was genuinely stunning. The overlook had a waist-high metal railing along the edge, installed after previous incidents at the same location. Multiple posted signs warned about loose rock and unstable ground beyond the barrier. A park ranger had already told the crowd directly to stay behind the railing because the ground past it was not stable. Becca heard all of that, but like most rules she didn't agree with, she didn't treat it as something that actually applied to her. At some point during their visit, a bighorn sheep appeared on the slope just beyond the barrier, probably only 30 or 40 feet away. People around her were pointing and pulling out their phones. Becca wanted a better shot. The railing, from her perspective, was in the way. She stepped past it. She moved about 8 to 10 feet beyond the barrier onto open sandstone. The surface looked solid from a distance, but loose gravel sat on top of slanted sections of stone near the overlook edge. She held her phone up and began backing toward the drop, trying to frame the shot. What happened next was pieced together from witness accounts. Her heel caught a patch of loose gravel on a slanted section of rock. She didn't trip dramatically. She just lost her footing. The kind of quiet, sudden shift that doesn't give you time to react. Her balance went, and she went with it. She fell down a steep, rocky incline, dropping approximately 35 to 40 feet before striking the side of her head on exposed stone. Witnesses at the railing saw it happen. Her brother was among them. Park medics reached her within several minutes. There was no pulse when they arrived. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death was blunt force head trauma. Witness statements confirmed she had been warned, and the ranger's address to the crowd was documented in the report. What I keep coming back to isn't the fall itself. It's how many layers of warning were already in place. A permanent barrier, multiple signs, a ranger who spoke directly to the crowd, and still, the view felt more important than the boundary. I don't say that to be harsh. I think most of us have pushed past something we probably shouldn't have. The difference is that most of us don't pay for it the way Becca did. Her 2 kids were standing at that railing when it happened. That detail alone is something I haven't been able to shake. The official report concluded the ground was unstable. Warnings had been clearly posted and verbally communicated, and the fall was consistent with terrain conditions at that section of the overlook. No foul play, no equipment failure, just a decision made in a few seconds that couldn't be undone. And for me, Becca's case keeps circling back to one thought. She saw the barrier, she heard the ranger, and she decided none of it applied to her. And that's what makes it stick, because it wasn't reckless in the way we usually picture reckless. It was just confidence in the wrong moment.
It was February 11th, 2014, and the ship was 3 days into a 7-day Western Caribbean itinerary, roughly 190 miles southwest of New Orleans in the Gulf of Mexico. No port stop that day, just open water and the kind of easy, do-nothing atmosphere that sea days tend to have. Renata's cabin was an interior stateroom on deck 7 with no window or balcony, which meant no natural light and no way to tell what time it was once the lights were off. Renata Solis was 61, a retired insurance broker from Tampa, Florida, traveling with 4 friends for a group retirement celebration. She had been dealing with chronic back pain and anxiety for several years and was on 2 prescriptions going into the trip, diazepam for the anxiety and oxycodone for the pain. According to her friends, she was the loudest and most social one of the group, the one who set the pace and didn't really take no for an answer when she wanted another round. By the first evening, she had already claimed a spot at the main bar and was there most of the night. Renata's friends had learned early on that telling her to slow down was a waste of breath, so no one really tried anymore. She had been drinking heavily from the first night. By the second evening, a bar crew member noticed she looked heavily sedated while still actively drinking. Glassy eyes, slow speech, out of it in a way that went beyond just needing sleep. He asked if she was okay and mentioned that some medications don't mix well with alcohol. She told him she knew her own body and that he should worry about his other customers. He flagged it with his supervisor afterward. The next day, one of her friends stopped by the medical bay for seasickness medication and mentioned offhandedly that Renata had been drinking heavily and seemed to be on some kind of prescription, pill bottles on the nightstand. More out of it than usual. The medical staff sent an officer to her cabin that afternoon. She answered the door in her robe, told him she was just tired and needed to sleep it off, and when he started explaining why he was there, she cut him off, said she didn't need a crew member at her door telling her how to manage her own health. He left a written advisory under her door outlining the risks and asked her to come in if anything felt off. There is no record of her visiting the medical bay after that. On the morning of the 5th day, Renata didn't show for the group's planned breakfast. Her friends figured she had overslept. It wouldn't have been the first time on this trip. By 11 a.m., she still hadn't answered knocks or the cabin phone. One of her friends tried calling twice from the corridor, then went to the front desk and asked for a welfare check. The crew member went to her cabin at around 11:20 a.m., knocked twice, and announced himself. And when nobody answered, he used a master key to enter. Renata was on her back on the bed, fully clothed and completely still. An empty wine glass on the nightstand, both prescription bottles open beside it. The medical team was called immediately. She had no pulse and wasn't breathing. They worked on her for 25 minutes and couldn't revive her. The cabin was completely undisturbed with nothing knocked over or out of place and no sign of any distress. She had gone to sleep and never woke up. Based on her body temperature at discovery, the medical team put the time of death somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m. The captain was notified and her body was moved to the ship's medical facility. Her 4 travel companions were told together in person by a senior crew member. The ship continued its itinerary and local authorities came aboard at the next port to formally document the scene. Her family in Tampa was notified through the cruise line that same afternoon. Her belongings were packed by crew and held until they could be collected. Toxicology confirmed diazepam, oxycodone, and ethanol all present in her system. None at an individually fatal level, but combined they were a different story. The 3 together amplify each other's effect on the central nervous system, and at a certain combined concentration, the brain simply stops regulating breathing. Manner of death was ruled accidental. The coroner's notes flagged one detail. The written advisory was found on the cabin floor, still folded, unread. 2 of her friends later told investigators they had no idea what medications she was on, and that if they had known, they would have said something sooner. The bar crew members' interaction and the medical officer's visit were both documented in the official record. No findings were made against the cruise line.
It was February 23rd, 2015. The Gold Coast beaches stretched under deceptively inviting skies. the kind of afternoon that drew families to the water, despite conditions that would prove deadly. Kylie Goldstein, 34, was about to make a series of decisions that would cost her everything. Kylie had lived on the Gold Coast for 8 years, moving from Brisbane after her divorce. Her 2 children, ages 7 and 9, often appeared hesitant around her, and neighbors had witnessed multiple public confrontations where Kylie berated them for minor infractions. She had accumulated 3 formal complaints from the local surf lifesaving club for previous incidents where she had argued with lifeguards. Swimming and beach activities formed Kylie's only reliable bonding time with her children, something she planned rigidly every weekend, regardless of conditions. She viewed beach safety warnings as suggestions rather than rules, evident from frequently telling other parents that lifeguards were overly cautious and that she knew the beaches well enough to make her own decisions. That afternoon, red flags lined the beach at a popular swimming area, warning of dangerous rip currents generated by offshore storm systems. Surf life-saving officers had announced beach closure over loudspeakers 3 times between 1 o'clock and 2:30 in the afternoon. Most families had already packed up and left. Kylie arrived with her children, immediately spotting the red flags. Her son pointed them out, asking if they should go home. According to the kids, Kylie told them they were swimming, or they would lose screen privileges for a month. At the water's edge, a lifeguard approached and explained the closure. Kylie interrupted repeatedly, demanding to know his qualifications and insisting the water looked fine from where she stood. The lifeguard radioed for backup as Kylie raised her voice, attracting attention from the dozen remaining beachgoers. She lectured him about taxpayer rights and overregulation, while her children stood behind her, clearly uncomfortable. When the lifeguard turned to address another family, Kylie grabbed her children by their wrists and pulled them into the water. They waded to waist depth within 90 seconds. The rip current, invisible from shore but devastating in force, caught all 3 immediately. The beach's steep nearshore shelf meant waist depth came quickly as they stepped out, and the rip formed a strong seaward channel just beyond the breaker line. The children began screaming as the current dragged them seaward. Kylie, likely realizing the danger too late, panicked and tried swimming directly against the current, exhausting herself instantly. 4 lifeguards entered the water within 30 seconds of her submergence. One paddled a rescue board, while another secured a rescue tube, and an inflatable rescue boat was launched and stood by for recovery. Following protocol, they prioritized the children, who were closer and more manageable. 2 lifeguards reached the kids within 2 minutes, securing them on rescue boards. Kylie was now 200 feet offshore, flailing wildly and screaming incoherently. Her panicked movements accelerated her fatigue. 2 lifeguards swam toward her position, but a large set of waves pushed her under. She resurfaced briefly, arms thrashing, before disappearing beneath the surface. The crew called emergency services immediately when they lost sight of Kylie. Visibility in the churned water made her location impossible. A multi-agency search involving surf life-saving teams, water police, and helicopter units continued until nightfall and resumed at dawn. Kylie's body washed ashore 2 days later, discovered by early morning walkers 3 kilometers south. Prevailing currents and wind likely carried the body along shore. The incident was later reviewed through a coronial investigation, and updated safety signage was installed at the beach entrance following the findings. Her children received mandatory trauma counseling funded by Victim Services.
On July 9, 2017, in Pamplona during the San Fermin Festival, streets were cleared and fenced for the run. Officials repeated the rules: stay behind barriers unless participating. Once the bulls were released, getting close wasn't just risky, it left no real way to get out safely. Elaine Foster, 56, had arrived from the US 2 days earlier. She had planned the trip around the festival, telling people back home she wanted something authentic, something she could experience up close. She wasn't there to run. She had no experience with it, but she was determined to get as close as possible to the route itself. That morning, she stood near a section of fencing where visibility was clear. Most tourists stayed behind the barriers, giving space as instructed. Elaine didn't. She kept shifting along the edge, trying to position herself closer to the opening between groups. Witnesses later said she complained openly about people blocking the view and grew irritated when a local volunteer told her to step back. And you know what coming next? She, instead of listening, she pushed back. It's that typical pattern. Being told no, then turning it into an argument about her rights, like the rule didn't apply to her. As the start approached, officials moved through the route again, clearing anyone too close to the corridor. Elaine stepped back when told, but only for a moment. As soon as the attention shifted further down the street, she edged forward again, slipping into a small opening near the barrier where the spacing wasn't fully controlled. At 8 a.m., the first rocket signaled the release of the bulls. The atmosphere changed instantly. Shouting, rapid footsteps, the sharp echo of hooves against stone. The animals moved fast, covering distance in seconds. Runners either kept ahead or pressed themselves flat against the walls as the bulls passed. Elaine had stepped partially into the route, still arguing with someone behind her who told her to move back. She turned her head briefly, distracted as the surge of runners approached. From her position, she misjudged how quickly the animals would close the distance. One of the trailing bulls broke slightly from the group as people shifted unevenly along the edge, reacting to the movement directly in front of it. Witnesses later said she turned too late. She tried to step back, but her footing caught against the uneven curb. That brief delay was enough. The bull lowered its head as it closed the distance, a natural motion when reacting to something directly in its path. The horn struck her in the lower abdomen and threw her backward. The force carried her backward, and she landed hard against the pavement as the bull continued forward with the group. The entire sequence lasted only a few seconds, but the damage was immediate. Emergency personnel stationed along the route moved in once the herd passed. They reached her within moments. At first glance, the injury didn't look as extensive as it was. There wasn't heavy external bleeding, but her condition declined quickly. Injuries like that don't just stay at the surface. The horn had penetrated deep enough to damage major internal structures. Paramedics began treatment on site, but she was already showing signs of severe internal bleeding, rapid breathing, loss of responsiveness, and a sharp drop in blood pressure. She was transported to a nearby hospital within minutes. Medical reports later confirmed the cause of death as internal hemorrhage from a penetrating abdominal injury. The trajectory of the horn had caused damage that couldn't be stabilized in time. Local authorities reviewed the incident as part of standard protocol. Footage and witness statements confirmed she had moved into a restricted section of the route just before the bulls were released. No failure in crowd control systems was identified. The barriers were intact and personnel had issued repeated warnings. In the end, it wasn't a hidden risk or a sudden failure. It was a controlled event with clear boundaries, entered at the wrong time, and at a distance that left no room to recover once the situation changed.
It was August 14th, 2018, in District 1, Ho Chi Minh City. If you've ever been, you know the vibe. The air is thick, humid from overnight rain, and the streets around Ben Thanh Market are already total chaos. Vendors, tourists, and delivery scooters are all weaving past each other on the damp asphalt. Meredith Mersel was one of the tourists. She was 46, living in Singapore with her private equity consultant husband and running a travel blog for wealthy expats. Meredith was sharp, great on camera, and knew her stuff when it came to high-end hotels. But she had this one really bad habit. She's overconfident. She constantly dismissed safety warnings from locals, calling it overcaution. She'd even film herself ignoring them, pitching it to her followers as being an authentic traveler. That morning, her hotel concierge connected her with a local guide who knew the area well. Before they even left the lobby, the guide noticed the massive diamond engagement ring on her hand and warned her that scooter thieves often targeted expensive jewelry. Meredith brushed off the warning, held up the ring for everyone to see, and insisted she wasn't going to hide it. With the ring still on her finger, she headed out and continued filming her trip. As they got close to the market, the traffic along the curb was heavy and fast. The guide warned her a second time. Instead of listening, Meredith actually stepped off the sidewalk into the road, putting her back to the traffic just to get a better camera angle. At 10:41 a.m., it happened. Two guys on a Honda scooter rode up from behind. The passenger reached out and grabbed her left hand, but because her ring had a thick band, it didn't just slip off, it got stuck on her knuckle. The sudden tug yanked Meredith off balance and pulled her into the roadway. The ring eventually came free, but by then she was already stumbling forward. She fell hard onto the pavement directly in the path of traffic. A second scooter traveling behind her had almost no time to react. The rider slammed on the brakes and tried to swerve, but couldn't avoid her. The scooter struck Meredith before sliding across the road. The thieves blended into traffic and vanished within seconds. The guide screamed for help, and a local vendor called for an ambulance. It took 20 minutes to get through the traffic, but by the time they arrived in the hospital, it was too late. She was pronounced dead an hour later. The autopsy later revealed that Meredith suffered catastrophic neck and spinal injuries when the second scooter struck her after the fall. The impact fractured her upper cervical vertebrae and caused fatal damage to her spinal cord. Her injured finger was one of the most visible wounds at the scene, but it wasn't what killed her. The fatal injuries came from being knocked into traffic and hit by the oncoming scooter. Investigators reviewed nearby security cameras and witness recordings, which provided clear images of the scooter and the suspects involved. Despite an extensive search, no arrests were made during the following months, and the diamond ring was never recovered. That's the part that makes the story especially grim. The one item Meredith refused to take off disappeared completely, while the decision to keep wearing it ultimately cost her far more than the ring itself.
It was August 18th, 2015, and San Antonio, Texas was deep into its summer. Afternoon temperatures were sitting above 95 degrees, the kind of heat that shortens tempers and makes everything feel more urgent than it probably is. The neighborhood was quiet on the surface. Residential streets, fenced yards, houses set close together. The kind of block where raised voices carry between properties and a dispute between neighbors doesn't stay private for long. By the time the argument reached the fence line, at least one neighbor had already stepped outside to see what was happening. Zenny Kryn was 47 years old. She worked in logistics dispatch, a role that runs on pressure, tight timelines, and the expectation that problems get resolved quickly. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't back down easily in a conflict and who pushed harder when she felt she wasn't being heard. On the afternoon she died, she was in the middle of an argument with a homeowner, a man in his mid-50s who worked in contracting, over a vehicle parked in a way she found unacceptable. The argument had started at the street and moved toward the property line. What strikes me about cases like this is that the personality description almost always sounds the same. Someone who pushed back, who didn't back down. And every time, I find myself wondering if they knew that about themselves, or if it just felt like being right. The homeowner was inside his yard behind a closed gate. He told her clearly not to open it and come in. The reason was direct. There was a dog loose on the property, and it was territorial. He wasn't being vague. He was telling her exactly what would happen if she came through that gate. Neighbors outside at the time later confirmed they heard the exchange. She opened the gate and stepped into the yard. The dog, a large, powerful breed consistent with guard-type dogs documented in the area, was loose within the enclosed space. A fenced yard with a single gate doesn't offer many options when something goes wrong, and the gate she had come through was now behind her. The dog reacted immediately. The combination of an unfamiliar person entering the enclosed space and the elevated voices of the ongoing argument triggered a defensive response. It moved toward her and made contact before she could turn back toward the gate. She attempted to retreat. In the initial struggle, she lost her footing and went down. Once on the ground, the dynamic shifted. The dog targeted the upper body and neck, behavior consistent with territorial defensive aggression in large breeds during a sustained encounter in a confined space. The enclosed yard gave her nowhere to move. The homeowner moved to intervene. Neighbors who heard the commotion called emergency services. The attack continued for a sustained period before the dog was successfully restrained. Witnesses described the homeowner making repeated attempts to intervene before the animal was finally brought under control. The confined space, the fall, and the time it took all contributed significantly to the severity of what followed. Severe trauma and significant blood loss occurred during the encounter, particularly from injuries sustained to the upper body and neck. Emergency responders arrived and secured the scene. Zenny Kryn was pronounced deceased at the scene. The official cause of death was traumatic injuries and blood loss sustained during the attack. Animal Control took custody of the dog for evaluation in accordance with local regulations. The homeowner cooperated fully with investigators throughout the process. Witness statements from neighbors confirmed that multiple warnings had been given before she entered the yard. The gate had been closed. The warning had been explicit. Investigators concluded the incident was a fatal animal attack following unauthorized entry into a secured private property. The record was straightforward. The warning was documented, the entry was documented, and the outcome followed directly from that one decision. I don't say this to be harsh, but the homeowner did everything right in that warning. He told her what was in the yard, why she shouldn't enter, and what the risk was. The outcome wasn't a failure of the warning. It was a failure to take it seriously.
It was July 20th, 2017, a hot Thursday afternoon in Missouri, the kind of summer day where the air sits heavy and the water is the only place anyone wants to be. The lake was a popular recreational spot, big enough for motorboats, pontoons, and the occasional jet ski cutting lines across the surface. By mid-afternoon, the water had decent traffic, wakes crossing over each other, engines humming in the distance, families anchored in coves with coolers and music. Rhoda Krell was 36 years old. She worked at a salon in town and was the kind of person who had to be in charge of everything. If there was a group outing, she picked the date, picked the location, and then found something wrong with all of it once they got there. That afternoon was one of hers. She'd gotten 3 friends together for a day on the water. They rented a motorboat from a small marina along the shore. A standard open bow rental, maybe 18 or 19 feet, enough room for 4 people and a cooler. Before they even got the keys, Rhoda told the rental operator the boat looked old and she wanted a different one. He explained it was the only one available. She asked to speak to a manager, then threatened to leave a review that would shut the place down. Her friends stood on the dock pretending to check their phones. When they boarded, the operator went through the basics. Life jackets were provided for every passenger. He strongly recommended wearing them at all times. Rhoda's friends put theirs on or kept them within reach. Rhoda picked hers up, told the operator it was dirty, and tossed it back under the seat. She told him she'd been on boats her whole life and didn't need someone at a rental dock telling her what to do. He asked her one more time to stay seated while moving and to wear the jacket. She waved him off. "I'm not telling you this to ridicule her. I'm telling you this because every piece of what happened next connects directly back to this moment. The jacket was right there. The warning had been given multiple times, and she didn't just decline it, she turned it into a confrontation she needed to win. They headed out onto the lake. One of the friends was driving, keeping a reasonable speed. Rhoda was standing near the side of the boat, not braced against anything. One friend asked her to sit down. Rhoda told her to stop worrying. Another brought up what the operator had said. Rhoda told her the operator didn't know what he was talking about. Then another boat passed, moving fast enough to throw a large wake across their path. Rolling waves, maybe 2 or 3 feet high, hitting them broadside. The bow lifted suddenly, not violent by boating standards, but abrupt. And Rhoda was standing. Her weight shifted. She lost her balance and went sideways over the rail. Not a dramatic launch, a stumble that the low rail couldn't stop. She hit the water near the side of the boat. Her friends expected her to surface immediately. A few seconds passed, then a few more. She didn't come up. The driver cut the engine. One of the friends jumped in and pulled her back onto the boat within seconds, but she was already unresponsive. Without a life jacket to keep her head above the surface, those few seconds underwater were all it took. Her friends started CPR right away. A rescue team reached them within minutes, but Rhoda never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead on the water. The official cause was listed as drowning following an accidental fall overboard. The operator was not cited. Passengers had been warned. Life jackets had been provided. Every safety measure had been offered, explained, and rejected. And that's the part that sits with me. The jacket was on the boat within arm's reach. The warning had been given over and over, and every single time she treated it like an insult, like the rules existed for other people. It was just a wake, a stumble, and a missing vest. 3 things that lined up in the worst possible order on an otherwise perfect afternoon. Her friends were right there. They got her out in seconds, and it still wasn't enough. A life jacket would have held her face above water for every single one of those seconds. I keep imagining being one of those friends, the ones who asked her to sit down, who reminded her about the jacket, who did everything right, and still having to carry that.
It was November 17th, 2016, and the ship was on the return leg of a 10-day Western Caribbean itinerary, roughly 310 miles southeast of Galveston in the Gulf of Mexico. The weather had been building all afternoon, swells getting bigger, the ship rolling in that slow, heavy way that makes you grab the handrail without thinking. By early evening, the captain issued a formal rough seas advisory over the intercom, and crew began clearing the main dining hall on Deck 5. The hall had floor-to-ceiling windows along the port side, and by that point, the water outside was dark and visibly rough. Phyllis Kipling was 63, a retired school librarian from Columbus, Ohio, on the trip with her daughter and son-in-law. She had been diagnosed with mild osteoporosis 2 years earlier after a routine bone density scan and had never mentioned it on any health or excursion forms. She had spent 40 years being the authority in the room, and clearly she had no interest in giving that up. Phyllis had stayed behind in the dining hall after her family went back to the cabin. She was midway through her dessert when a crew member came over and explained the captain's advisory clearly. Conditions were getting worse and passengers needed to clear the area. Phyllis looked up from her plate and told him she hadn't finished eating and that the ship had been rocking all day without any issue. He explained again that this was a formal advisory from the captain and not a general suggestion. She put her fork down, looked at him, and told him she had been on plenty of cruises and knew the difference between rough seas and something worth interrupting her dinner over. She told him to send the captain her regards and went back to her dessert. He logged the interaction with a timestamp and kept moving. Within a few minutes, every other table in the dining hall had cleared out. The lights over the empty tables, the windows rattling on the port side, and Phyllis sitting alone finishing her meal. At 7:31 p.m., 17 minutes after the advisory went out, Phyllis had actually left the dining hall with her family. She made it halfway down the corridor before she stopped. She had left her cardigan on the chair and told her daughter she wasn't about to have a crew member fetch it for her like she couldn't manage it herself. Her daughter told her to leave it. Phyllis turned around and went back in. She was back inside when the ship took a sharp roll to starboard. A wave struck the port bow and the whole room lurched hard to one side. Phyllis had just reached her table when the roll hit. It threw her sideways, her right side catching the edge of the table next to her with significant force before she went down to the floor. A crew member heard the impact and reached her in about 30 seconds. She was conscious and talking, but said she couldn't feel her hands and couldn't move her arms. Nobody moved her. The medical team arrived with a cervical collar and backboard and kept her completely still. She had no movement or sensation below her shoulders. The ship altered course toward the nearest port. She was stabilized in the medical bay and airlifted to a trauma facility about 4 hours after the incident. Her daughter was notified while still on the ship and flew out to meet her at the facility. She was with her when she died 38 hours later. Imaging confirmed a complete fracture and dislocation in the middle of her neck with total spinal cord damage. That level of injury progressively shuts down the ability to breathe independently, and her daughter made the decision to withdraw mechanical support. The osteoporosis made it worse in a specific way. Her bone density was low enough that it took significantly less force to produce that fracture than it would have in someone without it. The crew member's log was part of the official report, time-stamped, with her exact words about knowing the difference between rough seas and something worth interrupting her dinner over. The cardigan detail came out in the investigation, confirmed by her daughter. The cruise line was not found liable. Sometimes letting someone help you is all it takes. Phyllis couldn't quite manage that.
It was May 19th, 2018. The Overtoom bike lane in Amsterdam stretched wide and busy under overcast skies, a main artery where thousands of cyclists commuted daily through one of Europe's most bike-dependent cities. Brigitte van der Berg, a 52-year-old administrative assistant at a local municipal office, walked in the center of the lane with her terrier on a long, retractable leash, trailing across the pavement, blocking traffic during the evening rush. Brigitte had worked in Amsterdam for 3 decades, but had never adapted to the city's cycling culture. Colleagues described her as stubborn and confrontational, someone who took minor inconveniences personally. She owned no bicycle herself, preferring to walk her dog Max through whatever route seemed convenient, regardless of designated bike infrastructure. Friends had warned her repeatedly about wandering into bike lanes, but she always disregarded their concerns. Amsterdam's bike lanes operate like highways, with cyclists traveling at speeds between 15 and 25 miles per hour in dedicated infrastructure, separated from pedestrian walkways by clear markings and physical barriers. The Overtoom lane was particularly fast-moving, serving as a commuter route where cargo bikes hauling children and goods mixed with racing cyclists and electric bikes. Pedestrians entering these lanes face serious injury risk, a fact reinforced by city safety campaigns Brigitte had seen but ignored. That evening, Brigitte walked Max directly into the bike lane despite pedestrian crossings located every 50 yards. Multiple cyclists rang their bells frantically as she meandered along, looking at her phone while her dog sniffed the pavement. Traffic backed up behind her, a dozen riders forced to slow from 20 miles per hour to a crawl. A delivery cyclist shouted at her to move. Brigitte stopped completely, turning to yell back that she had every right to be there. The delivery rider swerved around her, clipping another cyclist and crashing onto the pavement. His groceries scattered across the lane. Instead of stepping aside, Brigitte began shouting louder about reckless cyclists, completely oblivious to the cargo bike approaching from behind at a distance too short for the rider to safely stop, approximately 25 feet away. The cargo bike's operator, transporting 2 children in the front box, rang his bell repeatedly while braking hard. Brigitte remained planted in place, gesturing angrily at the crashed delivery cyclist. The cargo bike, weighing approximately 200 pounds, loaded with its riders and cargo, struck Brigitte from behind at approximately 20 miles per hour, the impact lifting her off her feet. Her body flew forward feet before her head struck the top of a waist-high Amsterdammertje, a narrow, unpadded steel bollard lining the lane's edge. The hollow metallic clang echoed through the street as Brigitte crumpled to the ground. The leash released from her hand as it slipped free under tension while bystanders screamed. The cargo bike operator fell sideways, protecting his children, who were shaken but uninjured. A pedestrian called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, finding Brigitte unconscious with visible head trauma and labored breathing. She died en route to the hospital, despite resuscitation attempts. The autopsy revealed massive cranial fractures, thoracic trauma, 6 broken ribs, and severe internal hemorrhaging. The medical examiner confirmed the steel bollard impact as the primary cause of death, with blunt force trauma from the initial bike collision contributing. Amsterdam authorities used the incident to reinforce pedestrian safety regulations in bike lanes, installing additional warning signs along the Overtoom route. Investigators noted that nearby municipal CCTV and a cyclist helmet camera had captured the sequence of events, helping reconstruct the collision. Brigitte's terrier Max was rescued at the scene after being quickly retrieved by a bystander during the chaos, and later adopted by her neighbor, who had repeatedly warned her about the bike lanes she refused to respect.
It was November 3rd, 2017. Along Dashashwamedh Ghat in Varanasi, evening crowds gathered shoulder to shoulder as boats clustered along the river's edge. The Ganges moved slowly under fading light, its surface reflecting rows of lamps, while smoke from incense and oil flames thick and drifted low across the water. Elena Voss was 41, visiting from suburban Minneapolis, and this trip was something she had planned as a break from her usual routine. She preferred quieter spaces, avoiding crowded areas whenever she could, and built her itinerary around places where she could move freely without being pressed in by large groups. One of the events she had marked in advance was a riverside ceremony known for drawing heavy crowds along the banks. Instead of staying in the designated viewing areas, she fixated on getting closer than everyone else somewhere unrestricted, even if it meant stepping outside what was considered safe. Being near the center without the limitations mattered more to her than following instructions. That afternoon, she bought a long silk scarf from a street vendor and left it draped loosely over her shoulders. When she reached the dock, she hired a small wooden boat and immediately pushed to go beyond the standard viewing boundary. She offered extra cash, making it clear she expected special treatment and didn't intend to stay where the other boats were kept. When the boat reached the normal stopping point, she didn't accept it. She leaned forward, pointing closer to the ceremony and insisting the operator move in. The boatman refused, explaining the limit, but she argued over him, saying she had paid enough not to be held back. When he still hesitated, she pulled out more money and forced the decision, pressing him until he gave in. The boat moved into a tighter, restricted space closer than it was meant to be. Around them, attendants were swinging heavy fire lamps in wide, controlled arcs above the water. The routine only worked safely at a distance. Elena stepped right up to the front edge of the boat, ignoring repeated instructions to sit down and move back. She waved the operator off, still arguing, still focused on getting what she wanted. The boat shifted slightly under her as she leaned forward, but she didn't adjust in a meaningful way. She stayed at the edge, prioritizing her position over stability, over distance, over the obvious risk in front of her. Her scarf, loose and unsecured, slipped forward as she leaned. She didn't notice her attention was still on the argument and the ceremony. At the same moment, one of the attendants completed a full swing with the fire lamp. The flame extended outward at the peak of the motion. The fabric passed directly through it and ignited instantly. By the time the scarf caught, she was already off balance at the edge of the boat, reacting too late to a situation she had forced herself into. The fire spread up the scarf toward her neck within seconds. She reacted by grabbing the fabric and pulling it away, but instead of removing it, she pulled it inward against her chest and arms. This movement transferred the flames onto her clothing and skin. She stood upright suddenly, attempting to move away, but her balance was already compromised. Both hands were occupied, and her weight remained forward. With no stable support, she tipped over the front of the boat and fell into the river. The water extinguished the flames immediately. The boatmen and nearby attendants pulled her out within seconds. She remained conscious but was in visible distress with burns on her face, neck, and arms. She was laid on the boat floor while emergency assistance was called. She was transported from the river to a nearby medical facility as quickly as possible. During transport, her breathing became increasingly restricted. Shortly after arrival, she lost consciousness. Medical examination later confirmed burns covering more than half of her body. However, the primary cause of death was not external burn damage. Heat exposure caused severe swelling within her airway, progressively restricting airflow until breathing was no longer possible. She was pronounced dead later that night. The boatman was questioned and released, having initially attempted to maintain a safe distance.
It was June 22, 2016, out in Key Largo. By mid-morning, it was already brutal. Thick, sticky air and nearly 90 degrees before noon. The marina was packed and commercial boats had been churning up the channel since daybreak, sending these low, rolling wakes crashing into the docks every few minutes. The concrete near the slips was wet, dark, and incredibly slick. That morning, Cassandra Irons was there. At 54, Cassandra had built a small hotel empire in the Florida Keys, owning 4 boutique waterfront properties that started as a single struggling motel decades earlier. Nobody could deny she was successful. The problem was that Cassandra never let anyone forget it. She wasn't the kind of owner who stayed in an office. She was constantly walking properties, correcting employees, questioning managers, and inserting herself into jobs other people were already handling. Staff often joked that Cassandra could turn a 5-minute task into a 30-minute lecture. She also loved filming social media videos where she explained boating, hospitality, or business as if she were teaching a masterclass to everyone around her. The marina workers at Blackwater Cay knew her well, though not always in a good way. Several later described her as the type of person who treated every conversation like a competition. If someone knew something she didn't, she had to challenge it. If someone gave advice, she had to prove she knew better. And honestly, we've all met someone like that before. The person who can't simply be in the room. They have to be the smartest person in it. That morning, she brought 3 guests and her personal assistant to the docks to watch her brand new 52-foot motor yacht arrive from Fort Lauderdale. It was being delivered by a hired captain she'd never worked with before. Before the boat even made it to the slip, the dockmaster walked over and told the group to step back. He warned them that the wakes from the commercial traffic were heavy and the concrete was slick. Cassandra just waved him off. She told her assistant to keep filming, stepped closer to the edge, and started shouting docking directions at the captain. As the captain put the engines in reverse to slow down, a huge wake from a passing barge rolled into the marina. It slammed the boat's hull and pushed the back end 2 feet wider than the captain expected. On the dock, Cassandra took a step back, her right heel hitting a wet patch of concrete that sent her feet flying out from under her. But instead of trying to scramble away, Cassandra grabbed a concrete piling with both hands and turned back toward the yacht. Whether she was trying to steady herself or keep directing the docking process, the reaction placed her directly in the path of danger. It was a terrible mistake. The yacht's swim platform caught her across the left side of her chest, crushing her against the concrete piling. The boat surged a second time as another wave hit it. People standing just 15 feet away said they heard a sound like wood splitting. The boat pinned her for several seconds before bouncing away. Cassandra immediately collapsed at the base of the piling and did not get back up. Her assistant froze in shock for a moment before dropping the phone and rushing toward her. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived several minutes later, but Cassandra was already unresponsive. She was rushed to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead just after noon. The autopsy report was devastating. 8 broken ribs, a cracked breastbone, a torn liver, a ruptured spleen, and massive internal bleeding. She didn't hit her head or drown. The sheer pressure from the boat had crushed her. Following the tragedy, the marina painted bright red warning lines along the slips and made a strict rule. If you aren't crew, you stay behind the line until the boat is tied up. It's a smart safety move.
It was January 23, 2018, and Minneapolis was locked in the kind of winter that makes the whole city feel smaller. Temperatures had been fluctuating for weeks, freezing, then briefly thawing, then freezing again. That cycle is exactly what makes ice unpredictable. And it's what had been happening at a small neighborhood pond on the city's south side. The surface looked solid from the bank, but the signage at the water's edge told a different story. Kelly Spuff was 39. She worked in office administration, structured, routine-driven, used to things making sense. People who knew her said she pushed back when she felt she was being told what to do unnecessarily. She had the day off and went out for a walk to clear her head after a frustrating week, needing to feel in control of something small. She wasn't reckless in the usual sense, but when challenged, she had a tendency to push, to prove the point instead of stepping back. She arrived at the pond already in that mindset, looking for space, not a confrontation. The thin ice signs were clearly posted. A man nearby with 2 young children noticed her approaching the edge and warned her directly. He told her the ice wasn't safe. She paused just long enough to register it, then kept going, like the warning didn't apply to her, like it was something she could personally assess and dismiss. Near the shoreline, the ice was white and opaque, the kind that looks solid. Further out, darker patches showed where it was thinner. Those patches weren't subtle. The man called out again, louder. Witnesses said her steps changed, more deliberate. It stopped looking like a walk and started looking like a decision she didn't want to walk back from. I've covered enough of these cases to know that a sign and a verbal warning together almost never change the outcome. Kelly had both, and neither was enough. She stepped past the sign, and onto the ice. The surface held near the edge. She moved farther out, stomping as she went, testing it or making a point. It wasn't cautious. The stomping had a rhythm, exaggerated like she was proving something to the people watching. The cracking sound carried back to the bank. By then, the man had stopped warning and started pleading, telling her to come back, that his kids were watching. She kept going anyway, adding just a few more steps that made all the difference. She made it about 15 to 20 feet out before the surface gave way. The water was several feet deep. Cold shock is immediate. Gasping, rapid breathing, loss of control. She reached for the edge, trying to pull herself out, but the ice kept breaking under her grip, pushing solid ground farther away. The man found a long branch and extended it toward her, but he couldn't reach without risking the ice himself. He stayed at the edge and kept trying. Within minutes, cold incapacitation set in. Strength dropped. Coordination failed. Her movement slowed. What stands out is how fast it turned, from control to panic, from proving a point to fighting for seconds. With no time left to correct it, she was conscious and trying for a period that felt long to the people watching, and there was nothing they could do. By the time emergency services arrived, she had gone under. Responders recovered her from the water. She was unresponsive. Efforts to revive her failed, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was cold water immersion, cold shock, incapacitation, then drowning. Investigators confirmed both signage and a direct warning had been present. The pond was temporarily closed. No changes to signage were recommended. It had been clear and correct. The warnings worked. They just weren't followed.
It was July 4th, 2018 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The kind of evening where the whole block smells like charcoal and bug spray and every other house has a flag hanging off the porch. Temperatures had been sitting in the low 90s all day, and by the time the sun started dipping, the air was still warm enough that nobody had gone inside yet. On a quiet residential street, a handful of families had gathered the way they did every year. Lawn chairs dragged to the curb, coolers between driveways, kids running through sprinklers 2 houses down. It was one of those neighborhood setups where nobody really planned it. It just kind of happened because everyone was already outside. Cheryl Goad was 44. She worked at a small billing office, the kind of job where you spend most of your day on the phone sorting out other people's paperwork. Her husband, 46, was a mechanic. They lived nearby and had walked over to join the group once the grilling started winding down. One of the neighbors, a 49-year-old guy who worked in maintenance, had put together a small firework display. Not store-bought fountains or sparklers, he had assembled his own mortar tubes using cardboard, black powder lift charges, and aerial shells pulled from retail firework kits. The tubes were set into a wooden rack on his driveway, angled upright the way they needed to be to launch properly. He had even marked a line on the pavement, roughly 15 feet back, and told everyone to stay behind it. He explained that the tubes had to stay locked in the rack because without that support, the pressure from the lift charge could split the cardboard on ignition. A few people nodded. Most were just waiting for the show. The first few shots went off fine. Shells popped up, burst in the air, and the kids screamed the way kids do. But between rounds, there were gaps. Loading each tube took time, and the pacing started to drag. Cheryl got impatient. She stepped past the marked line and walked toward the rack. The neighbor told her to stop, that one of the tubes was already loaded and ready to fire. She picked it up anyway, just grabbed it out of the rack and held it upright in front of her body. She told someone nearby to go ahead and light it so they could keep things moving. Now, here is where everything falls apart. That tube was about 12 inches long. Inside it sat a 2-inch aerial shell on top of a black powder lift charge. The fuse had been cut shorter earlier in the night to reduce the delay between shots. Without the rack, the tube had no support. It was tilted slightly in her hands, and the structural integrity of the cardboard was now entirely dependent on her grip. The neighbor told her more than once to put it back. She didn't. The fuse was lit while she was still holding the tube. It burned fast, faster than anyone expected. The shortened length meant the flame reached the lift charge almost immediately. The charge ignited, but the shell didn't clear the tube. Instead, the pressure split the cardboard along the side, and the shell burst right there at the top of the tube, inches from her upper body and head. And honestly, it's unsettling to know how close she was to the danger without even realizing it. Witnesses described a loud pop, a flash of smoke, and pieces of the tube scattering across the driveway. Cheryl dropped to the ground instantly and did not move. She never responded. By the time county responders arrived, there was nothing they could do. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Fire officials examined what was left of the device and confirmed the tube had been removed from the launch rack before ignition. Multiple witnesses gave consistent statements. She had crossed the safety line on her own, picked up the loaded tube despite being warned, and refused to put it back. Investigators also noted the shortened fuse and the lack of support at the time of firing. The components were consistent with consumer-grade fireworks, but the way the device was handled at the moment of ignition created the failure. No charges were filed. The death was ruled accidental firework misuse. What stays with me is how small the window was. She was warned not to cross the line, told the tube was loaded, and told more than once to put it back. Each one a chance to walk away. But impatience doesn't feel dangerous. It just feels like moving things along. And sometimes that's all it takes. And if Cheryl's story taught me anything, it's that impatience doesn't announce itself as danger. It just feels like efficiency.
It was June 14th, 2019, and the ship had docked at Cozumel just after 7 a.m. The parasailing concession ran out of a small marina about 10 minutes from port. A solid operation, been running the same excursion off the same dock for 15 years. No serious incidents on record. Marguerite Hollis was 61, a retired school administrator from Akron, Ohio, traveling solo on a 9-day Western Caribbean cruise. She had booked the parasailing excursion 4 days out, paid in full, and on the online waiver she listed her weight as 200 pounds. The operator's equipment was rated for a maximum solo passenger weight of 275 pounds, not a guideline, but the actual engineering limit everything on that rig was built around. Marguerite Hollis weighed 402 pounds. That figure came from the medical examiner. I just know this story isn't going to end well the moment that waiver comes up. Parasailing weight limits are not suggestions. Once a passenger goes past them, the harness and tow line start handling forces they were never built for, especially once the wind picks up. The lead operator clocked the discrepancy within 30 seconds of her arriving at the dock. He asked if the listed weight was current and requested she step onto the dock scale, standard procedure for solo passengers. Marguerite immediately took the request personally. She accused the staff of trying to embarrass her publicly, reminded them she had already paid $180 for the excursion, and repeatedly talked over attempts to explain the policy. By the end of the exchange, she was threatening a detailed complaint review if they refused to launch her. He made one more attempt, warning her that the wind was already at 18 knots and still rising, and that overloaded parasailing harnesses in those conditions could fail without much warning. Marguerite dismissed it as scare tactics. She insisted she had parasailed before and demanded they finish gearing her up. Later, neither operator could explain why they didn't just walk her back to the shuttle. The lead operator let her through. The harness fitting was a problem from the start. Nothing fit. The chest and leg loops maxed out well short of closing, and when the second operator went to get an extension strap, Marguerite asked loudly why this was taking so long. The strap she came back with was an auxiliary extension strap normally reserved for borderline tandem adjustments, not overloaded solo launches in worsening wind. The lead operator knew what it was and said nothing. The spreader bar rode up toward her chin because the geometry was completely wrong, and when the second operator tried adjusting it, Marguerite grabbed her wrist and told her it was fine and to stop fussing. They launched at 9:47 a.m. Wind was reading 18 knots. The ascent went sideways almost immediately. At around 60 feet, a gust pushed the canopy hard left, and the operator throttled up to compensate, loading the harness attachment points hard. The extension strap at the left shoulder audibly popped. The second operator heard it from the deck, but held. At 90 feet, the canopy briefly stabilized. Then a harder gust hit from the northwest. The line went slack for 2 seconds and snapped taut as the canopy reinflated. That shock load on a compromised harness carrying more than twice its rated weight was the end of the sequence. The lead operator called for emergency descent. The boat slowed, the canopy lost lift, and she dropped faster than the procedure was designed to handle. She hit the water somewhere between 35 and 45 miles per hour. Feet first, then immediate full-body lateral impact as the canopy dragged her sideways. Both operators were in after her within seconds. She was face down and not moving. They got her onto the boat and started CPR. She was pronounced dead at 10:48 a.m. Blunt force trauma, drowning as a secondary factor. 7 ribs fractured on the right side. 2 displaced inward, right lung collapsed. The investigation found the falsified waiver weight as the origin point of every failure that followed. The wrongful death claim filed by her family the following year was dismissed. The lead operator kept his license. The concession kept running.
It was March 12th, 2013. The Swiss Alps stretched under deceptively calm skies, hiding dangers that would claim a life before sunset. Greta Zimmermann, a 65-year-old retired schoolteacher from Zurich, was at the base of a restricted avalanche zone with her husband Klaus, drawn by terrain that would test her lifelong habit of bending rules for recognition. Greta had spent 40 years hiking alpine trails, accumulating an impressive catalog of summit photos and trail completions across Switzerland and Austria. She had a reputation among fellow hikers as someone who argued loudly with rangers and staff. She frequently told other hikers that particular signages were ridiculous and that she deserved access because she was experienced and had hiked these mountains for decades. Friends described her as fearless but dismissive of authority, and she often escalated minor disputes into verbal confrontations over perceived restrictions. Alpine hiking demands respect for rapidly changing conditions, where avalanche-prone slopes can release without warning when snowpack stability deteriorates, requiring constant assessment of terrain features and weather patterns that determine whether a trail remains passable or becomes a deadly trap. Although experienced, she had left her avalanche transceiver and airbag behind that morning, saying she only planned a quick shot. That morning, regional avalanche services had issued critical warnings across the Alps. Fresh snowfall throughout the previous week had created unstable layers, and rising temperatures were destabilizing snowpack on south-facing slopes. Multiple trails near the popular resort area where Greta and Klaus were staying had been closed with barriers and prominent warning signs detailing extreme avalanche danger. Weather bulletins explicitly warned against any off-piste activity or venturing near closed trails. Klaus urged Greta to stay within the resort boundaries, pointing to the warning signs and recent avalanche bulletins posted at the base lodge. She dismissed his concerns, saying the closed trail offered perfect photo opportunities and that authorities were overly cautious. Other hikers at the lodge noticed the couple's discussion and watched as Greta approached the barrier marking the restricted zone. Greta had ducked under the barrier and walked approximately 300 feet up the closed trail. Klaus remained at the barrier, visibly distressed. Several guests at the base lodge watched through the large windows as Greta positioned herself for a selfie against the mountain backdrop. A guest raised binoculars. Above her, the massive snowfield showed subtle signs of instability that she either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The slope angle exceeded 35 degrees, well within the critical range for slab avalanche formation. The vibrations from her movement triggered the release. The snowfield fractured with a deep crack that propagated rapidly across the slope. Witnesses at the lodge saw the entire mountainside begin moving, a massive wall of snow cascading downward with terrifying speed. Trees snapped like twigs as the avalanche gained momentum, consuming everything in its path. Greta disappeared instantly into the churning white mass. Klaus screamed for help as the avalanche thundered past, stopping roughly 150 feet from where he stood. Lodge staff immediately contacted mountain rescue services. The avalanche had deposited debris across a wide area, burying the trail under tons of compacted snow. Rescue teams arrived within 30 to 40 minutes with probes and avalanche search dogs. The dogs helped narrow search areas, but careful probing and shovel lines were still required. Rescuers located Greta's body 4 hours later, after a prolonged search by which point survival was, tragically, no longer realistic. She had died from asphyxiation, her airways completely blocked by snow she'd inhaled during the tumbling descent. The medical examiner noted multiple traumatic injuries from colliding with trees and debris during the avalanche's violent descent, along with evidence of hypothermia that contributed to her death. Klaus returned to Zurich with Greta's remains. A small funeral was held at the local cemetery, attended by close family and a few hiking friends.
It was May 6th, 2018, inside a crowded market stall in Tokyo, Japan, where everything felt tight and fast at the same time. The walkway was packed, people stood shoulder to shoulder, and every stall had a line spilling into the street. Vendors worked non-stop, calling out orders, turning skewers over hot grills, while customers tried to eat quickly and move on. It was one of those places where you either follow the flow or you get in the way. Melissa Grant was 54, visiting from Arizona, and this trip came right after a recent divorce. The settlement had left her financially comfortable, and she used it to plan a solo trip she had been thinking about for months. She approached each stop with a fixed idea of how things should go, expecting things to move on her terms, without delays or pushback. At the market stall, a line had already formed. Instead of joining it, she stepped off to the side and leaned toward the counter, trying to order ahead. The vendor responded briefly and gestured back toward the line, but there was a clear language barrier. He spoke limited English, and she didn't understand his instructions. Rather than step back, she repeated her order louder, assuming he hadn't heard her. When he pointed again to the line, she grew frustrated, saying she had been waiting long enough, even though she had just arrived. A few people nearby tried to explain, telling her she needed to queue like everyone else, but she turned on them, arguing that the process didn't make sense and that she was being ignored. The more the vendor tried to redirect her, the more she spoke over him, her tone sharpening as the misunderstanding escalated. The exchange drew attention from others in line, but she stayed where she was, talking over both the vendor and the customers, until he finally handed her a serving just to move things along. She stepped aside only slightly, still close to the stall, continuing to complain, partly about the wait, partly about not being understood. The skewer of grilled mochi dumplings hung loosely in her hand as she spoke, the thick glaze stretching slightly with each movement. Still mid-argument, she took a bite without pausing, her focus fixed on the ongoing back and forth rather than the food. She kept talking as she chewed, more concerned with pressing her point than paying attention to what she had just put in her mouth. If you've ever had mochi, you know it's not something you rush. It's thick, stretchy, and it needs time to break down. But she didn't give it that time. She chewed briefly, then swallowed too early. And at first, it just felt off, like it wasn't going down properly. Her expression shifted slightly, not panic yet, more irritation, like something didn't feel right, and she tried to swallow again, expecting it to fix itself. But nothing moved. Her hand went to her throat, and her breathing started to change, becoming shorter and tighter. She coughed once, then again, trying to force it out, but the mochi didn't break apart. It stayed intact, blocking her airway more completely with each second. People nearby began to notice, and someone asked if she was okay, but she didn't respond clearly. Instead, she made a quick, dismissive motion with her hand, like she was brushing it off, like she didn't need help, even though her body was already showing otherwise. Her coughing became weaker, her posture shifted, and the way she moved made it clear something was wrong. That was when someone stepped in. A man moved behind her and tried to help, pulling her slightly forward and attempting abdominal thrusts. The first attempt didn't work, and when he tried again, there was still no change. The mochi held its shape, refusing to break apart or move. By then, her body was starting to give out. Her knees bent, her strength dropped, and within seconds, she collapsed forward. People caught her before she hit the ground and lowered her carefully while someone nearby called emergency services. Another attempt was made to clear the blockage, but nothing changed. By the time paramedics arrived, several minutes had already passed. They took over immediately, working to restore her breathing, but there was no response. She was rushed to a nearby hospital where she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause was simple. She had choked on a dense piece of food. There was no underlying condition, no hidden issue, just something that needed time and attention, rushed in the middle of everything else.
It was March 12, 2017, in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's around 7:42 p.m., and a high-end fundraiser is winding down inside a historic mansion, tucked behind stone gates and manicured grounds. The ceilings stretch nearly 20 feet overhead. The marble floors shine under antique chandeliers, and every step sends the sound of expensive heels echoing through the cavernous halls. One of the guests was Jacqueline McDuff. At 43, Jacqueline was a successful divorce attorney. Jacqueline built her reputation by winning ugly courtroom battles and making sure everyone knew it. Friends described her as confident. Former colleagues usually chose less flattering words, and the more I learned about her, the more it seemed like being noticed mattered just as much to her as actually winning. Status wasn't something Jacqueline enjoyed quietly. It was something she displayed. Her social media was packed with luxury resorts, VIP events, designer shopping trips, and photos carefully arranged to remind followers how successful she was. But nothing mattered more than the 3 custom-made diamond and gold cuff bracelets she wore almost everywhere. Together, they were worth nearly $200,000. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with expensive jewelry, but when one accessory costs more than most people's houses, it stops being jewelry and starts becoming a statement. The bracelets weren't subtle. They covered most of her left forearm, weighed several pounds, and caught attention from across a room, and Jacqueline loved that. Throughout the evening, she repeatedly redirected conversations back to them. Several guests later recalled her asking people to guess their value before proudly correcting them. At one point, she reportedly joked that one bracelet cost more than some guests earned in a year. Not everyone laughed. As the party wound down, Jacqueline decided the night needed one more social media post. She headed toward the mansion's grand marble staircase and instructed her assistant to stand at the bottom with his phone. She didn't want a video of the staircase or the mansion. She wanted a close-up of the bracelets. Just before filming began, another guest warned her that the polished marble steps were slippery and her stiletto heels looked unstable. Jacqueline barely acknowledged the comment. Instead, she reminded her assistant to keep the camera focused on her left arm. Then she started down the staircase. Halfway down, everything went wrong. The heavy stack of bracelets shifted repeatedly against her wrist and forearm. Witnesses later said she kept subtly adjusting her arm to keep the jewelry positioned toward the camera. When she reached a lower section of the staircase, the weight of the bracelets suddenly slid downward again. The movement pulled at her sleeve and threw her balance off just enough for her left heel to land awkwardly on the edge of a marble step. Her foot slipped instantly. She lost her footing and pitched forward. Witnesses watched as she instinctively threw her left arm toward the brass handrail, but the sudden fall happened too fast. The extra weight on her forearms swung outward as she fell, twisting her body sideways instead of toward the railing. Her hand brushed the rail but never secured a grip. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, but Jacqueline was completely unresponsive. Security footage later showed the bracelets shifting moments before the slip and swinging heavily during the fall, contributing to the loss of balance that sent her sideways down the staircase. She never woke up. The coroner's report was grim: multiple skull fractures, severe brain trauma, broken neck vertebrae, and massive internal bleeding. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma, and investigators concluded that the unusually heavy bracelets likely contributed to the initial loss of balance and the awkward body position during the fall. Following the investigation, the mansion's owners reviewed the staircase area and implemented additional safety measures. As for Jacqueline's estate, it was settled the following year. Those exact diamond cuffs, recovered completely intact, ended up in an estate auction catalog, listed with tragic irony as the centerpiece of her collection.
It was July 20th, 2017, and Phoenix was in the middle of one of its most punishing summers. Temperatures at the city's main airport were hovering above 105 degrees that afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the tarmac shimmer. It was a busy travel day. Gates were full, ground crews were moving efficiently, and flights were running on schedule. Carolyn Floss was 45 years old. She worked in retail management, the kind of role where authority was the default, and being overruled didn't sit well with her. By multiple accounts, she was someone who pushed hard against rules she found inconvenient and expected exceptions to be made. On that afternoon, she was traveling with her 14-year-old nephew, and the two of them arrived at their gate late. Not marginally late, but late enough that boarding calls had already gone out multiple times. By the time they got there, the jet bridge door was sealed. The aircraft, a smaller regional jet, had finished boarding, and the crew was already in pre-departure procedures. A gate worker explained the door was closed and the flight was not returning to the gate. That did not go over well. Carolyn began arguing with the staff, raising her voice, filming the encounter on her phone, and accusing the workers of abusing their authority. Other travelers watched. Multiple staff members tried to de-escalate. None of it landed. I want to be fair. Missing a flight with a teenager in tow is genuinely stressful. I get that. What I don't understand is what she did next. While attention near the gate briefly shifted, she moved toward a service access point along the side of the terminal, a door used intermittently by ground crew for ramp access. In that narrow window, she made it through into the secured ramp area. An alarm activated the moment she crossed that threshold. Ground personnel on the ramp spotted her and moved to intercept, shouting for her to stop. She did not. She continued moving across the active tarmac toward the aircraft, which had just begun taxiing away from the gate with its engines running at low to moderate power. The fact that it was a smaller regional jet matters here. That type has engines mounted lower on the fuselage, which puts the intake hazard zone much closer to ground level. Most people never think about what that kind of engine does to the air around it. By the time you feel the pull, you're already past a point of no return. As she moved into the marked hazard perimeter, the airflow became strong enough to disrupt her footing. Witnesses on the ramp later reported seeing loose debris near her shifting toward the engine. Her clothing pulled forward. She lost her balance and went down on the pavement. The intake forces at that range pulled her further forward after she lost her footing, drawing her deeper into the immediate hazard zone, where she sustained severe blunt force trauma. The flight crew initiated an emergency engine shutdown within seconds of visual confirmation. But that call, fast as it was, came too late. This is the story I just couldn't stop thinking about, not because it was so shocking, but because she had so many chances to turn around and just kept going. Emergency responders secured the ramp area within minutes. Carolyn Floss was pronounced deceased at the scene. Her nephew, who stayed in the gate area, was taken into the care of relatives. He was not physically harmed. Investigators reviewed alarm logs, ramp footage, and statements from gate staff and ground crew. Findings were consistent. Safety systems were active and functioning throughout. Warnings had been issued at every stage. She continued past all of them. The incident was classified as a fatality resulting from unauthorized entry into an active aircraft movement area and contact with engine hazard forces. No equipment failure was identified. No airport procedural failures were found. Everything worked. The alarm triggered. The crew responded. The systems did exactly what they were built to do. The only thing that failed was the one decision that started all of it.
It was November 20th, 2015, a gray Friday evening in suburban Ohio, the kind of town where the stoplights outnumber the restaurants and most people drive the same route home without thinking twice. The intersection sat where a 4-lane highway met a smaller cross street. Pavement was dry, visibility was fine, rush hour had thinned out. Just another evening where everyone was trying to get somewhere warm. Deanna Spiff was 38, worked as a clerk at a nearby warehouse, and by most accounts had an opinion about everything, and made sure you heard it. She wasn't the type to back down when someone told her what to do. She'd been written up more than once for arguing with supervisors over policies she thought were stupid. The kind of person who, if you told her the floor was wet, would walk across it faster just to prove she could. That night, she left the warehouse with 2 co-workers in a compact sedan. Deanna took the front passenger seat. Now here's where the decisions start to stack up. Except with Deanna, they weren't small. They were loud. The driver reminded everyone to buckle up. Deanna told him not to tell her what to do. said she'd been riding in cars since before he had a license. The driver pushed back. His car, his rule. Deanna grabbed the seatbelt, made a show of pulling it across her chest, then deliberately tucked the strap behind her back without clicking it in. She looked right at him while she did it, like compliance was beneath her. The driver let it go. Most people do when someone turns a seatbelt into a power struggle. But Deanna wasn't done. She spent the drive complaining. The temperature, the route, the warehouse changing the brake schedule without asking her. She told the driver he was going too slow. Then, too close to the car ahead, she changed the radio without asking. When the driver adjusted it back, she called him controlling. This matters, not because the argument caused the crash, but because it paints someone who had made defiance a reflex. Every rule was an insult. The seatbelt wasn't a strap she forgot to click. It was a line she refused to let someone else draw. The car was doing about 40, approaching an intersection with a green light. No reason to slow down, and then another vehicle entered the intersection against a red light. No buildup, no screeching tires. It struck the sedan directly on the front passenger side, Deanna's side, at 40 miles per hour without a seatbelt. The physics are brutal. Her body moved forward on impact. Her head struck the dashboard and windshield. The force threw her sideways into the door frame. She lost consciousness instantly. The crash folded around her in a way that the belt, the one she'd turned into a statement, was designed to prevent. The driver and rear passenger, both belted, survived with minor injuries. That's what makes this case unbearable. Two people in the same wreck walked away because of a 3-second decision Deanna refused to make. Not forgot. Refused. Same car, same crash. The only difference was a click and the pride that wouldn't allow it. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Deanna was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The police report listed the absent seatbelt as a direct contributing factor. The other driver was cited for running the red light. No further charges filed. A warehouse shift, a short drive, a belt tucked behind the seat to win an argument no one else was having, and a light someone else decided to run. What gets me isn't the crash itself. It's that she had the one thing that could have saved her in her hands, and shoved it behind her back because someone suggested she use it. The danger wasn't the intersection. It was the attitude that no rule and no person had the right to tell her what was good for her. The rear passenger walked away with bruises. The driver went home that night. Deanna didn't. The only variable was a seatbelt waiting for a click that her pride wouldn't allow. She didn't die from ignorance. She died from defiance. The seatbelt wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And physics doesn't bend for that.
It was April 22nd, 2016, and the ship had docked on the western shore of Grand Cayman just after 8 a.m. The kayaking excursion launched from a small beach near the port into open coastal water about half a mile offshore. Flat surface, light wind, good visibility. Cressida Mabry was 52, a marketing director from Charlotte, North Carolina, on a 7-day Caribbean cruise with 2 work colleagues. If Deb Felker was reckless and Phyllis Kipling was stubborn, Cressida had spent her career finding ways around problems other people said couldn't be solved. Well, that works great in a boardroom, but on the open water, not really how it works. Being told what to do by a kayaking guide in Grand Cayman was not something she had any interest in entertaining. A Portuguese man-o-war is not actually a jellyfish. It's a colony of individual organisms that work together as one creature. The float you see on the surface is just the visible part. The tentacles hang below, sometimes stretching dozens of feet down, and they stay venomous even when they break off and drift on their own. From a kayak on the surface, you are seeing maybe 10% of what is actually there. About 20 minutes into the paddle, the guide spotted a cluster of man-o-war ahead, that unmistakable blue-purple float sitting on the surface across a stretch of water in front of them. He called the group to stop and told them they were heading back. Cressida asked if they could go around. He explained that the tentacles ran far deeper than anything visible from the surface, and there was no safe way through. She said she had been stung before, and it was fine. He told her the call was not up for discussion. Every other kayak in the group started turning. Cressida told him she had paid for a full hour and wasn't going back early over some jellyfish. Then she just started paddling forward on her own. She had gone about 80 feet ahead when her left paddle dragged through a cluster of submerged tentacles that snapped back across her forearm, hand, and calf. She pulled her arm back and called out that she had been stung. Within 90 seconds, her voice changed, and she called out again that she couldn't breathe. Here is what nobody on that water knew, including Cressida. 3 years earlier, a wasp sting had sent her to an urgent care clinic in Charlotte with hives, throat tightening, and blood pressure low enough that they kept her for 4 hours. An allergist confirmed hypersensitivity to insect and marine venom and prescribed an epinephrine autoinjector. She filled it. She carried it most of the time, not out of fear, but because she was practical. She had not brought it that morning. It was in the cabin safe back on the ship. By the time the guide reached her, she was hunched forward, lips going blue, breathing in a high-pitched wheeze you could hear across the water. He pulled alongside to stabilize both kayaks and radioed the second guide. Within 40 seconds, she tipped into the water. He was in after her immediately and had her face up within seconds, but she had already taken water in and was unresponsive. They got her to the beach and started CPR. She never responded. Emergency services took her to a medical facility on Grand Cayman, where they worked on her for another 35 minutes before calling it. The post-mortem was straightforward. The prior wasp sting had sensitized her immune system. When the man-o'-war venom hit, her body treated it as a known threat, airways swelling, blood pressure collapsing, faster and harder than it would have in someone without that history. The immersion finished what the venom started. Epinephrine in the first 2 minutes might have bought enough time. There was none on the water. There was one in the cabin safe 11 miles away. The guide's radio log and every witness account lined up. The operator's safety review came back clean. Her 2 colleagues were the ones who identified her at the facility. Neither of them had been on the water when it happened. 30 years of being the smartest person in the room. How does someone like that not learn to listen?
It was August 3rd, 2017. The afternoon sun beat down on a mid-tier hotel pool in Seminyak, Bali, where families splashed in the shallow end and tourists lounged under rented umbrellas. Diane Mitchell, a 48-year-old administrative manager from Perth, Australia, sat rigid in her deck chair, visibly irritated by the noise around her. Diane had earned a reputation back home for being difficult. Neighbors complained about her filing noise complaints against children playing in their yards. Her homeowners association record showed multiple disputes over minor infractions. Co-workers described her as controlling and quick to escalate disagreements into formal complaints. They said she approached life with a rigid sense of order, believing rules applied absolutely to everyone except herself, when inconvenient. This trip to Bali was supposed to be a reset after being forced into stress leave following workplace conflicts. But Diane's confrontational nature traveled with her. The hotel pool area was designed for family use, with designated quiet zones clearly marked away from the main swimming area. Diane had deliberately chosen a lounger in the active family section, despite staff suggesting the adults-only pool on the property's other side. She refused to move, insisting she had the right to sit where she pleased, and staff did not want to escalate the disagreement. She spent the morning glaring at children and muttering complaints to other guests, most of whom ignored her increasingly hostile demeanor. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, a 14-year-old Indonesian boy named Adi accidentally splashed water near Diane's chair while playing with friends. Diane exploded from her seat, screaming profanities at the teenager. Adi apologized immediately in broken English, but Diane continued her tirade, demanding he be removed from the pool area. Hotel staff began approaching to de-escalate the situation. Before staff could intervene, Diane spotted Adi's tablet device sitting poolside and grabbed it. Multiple witnesses watched in shock as she held it over the water, taunting the boy, before hurling it into the deep end. The expensive device sank immediately to the pool's 8-foot-deep bottom. Adi, panicked about losing his family's only tablet, dove after it without hesitation, despite being an inexperienced swimmer. Staff were momentarily distracted by other guests, and initial shouts were mistaken for horseplay, so no one reached the boy immediately. The boy struggled underwater, his movements visible through the clear water, as he grasped the tablet but couldn't push himself back up. His friends screamed for help. Diane stood at the pool, arms crossed. Addie's father, who had been inside the hotel, came running as the on-duty lifeguard and hotel security entered the water. The chaotic rescue attempt took nearly 45 seconds. Addie was pulled out after struggling underwater due to panic and the weight of the tablet, and CPR was initiated immediately while someone called emergency services. During the commotion, Addie's uncle, witnessing the entire incident and overcome with rage, shoved through the crowd and struck Diane once in the face with a closed fist. The punch sent Diane stumbling backward. Her feet slipped on the wet tiles, and she fell hard, the back of her skull impacting the slick concrete pool, coping with a sickening crack. She collapsed onto the deck, blood from a scalp laceration immediately pooling beneath her head. Paramedics arrived following a call from the staff. Addie regained consciousness and survived. Diane did not. She was pronounced dead at a local hospital 90 minutes later. The coroner's report identified severe skull fractures at the base of her head, massive internal bleeding between her brain and skull, and fatal brain swelling. Death resulted from blunt force trauma to the head sustained in the fall. Addie's uncle was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. He received a suspended sentence. Diane's family settled civil claims filed by the hotel and Addie's family for property destruction and endangerment.
On March 14, 2015, Maeklong Railway Market in Samut Songkhram, Thailand, operated directly along active tracks. Vendors arranged goods inches from the rails, with narrow walkways crowded by tourists. Low awnings, folding tables, and tightly packed stalls defined a space built around precise timing, limited clearance, and constant movement. One of the tourists there that day was Susan Hartley, 58, from Scottsdale, a retired vice principal. She had spent years telling people where to stand, when to move, and how things should be done. And even in retirement, that mindset didn't really fade. It just showed up in places like this. And I'll be honest, the moment I read that, I already had a feeling where this was heading. This stop at the market wasn't just another part of the tour for her. She wanted to see the train up close in person and take photos she could bring home, something more direct and memorable than what she had seen online. She already had a clear idea of the shot she wanted, with the train coming straight toward her. She arrived early and moved through the narrow lanes with purpose, stopping right beside the tracks. Not at a safe distance, but close enough that it was already pushing the limit. She adjusted her position, shifting side to side, raising her phone, checking angles, moving like the space was hers to control, as if she understood the timing better than the people around her. A vendor nearby noticed immediately and tried to warn her, pointing at the rail and gesturing outward to show how far back she needed to be. Susan gave a quick wave without even lowering her phone. That part stands out because it shows she knew someone was trying to warn her, but not enough to actually change what she was doing. Not long after, another tourist stepped in, more direct this time, using both hands and speaking clearly, trying to make her see how close she really was. Susan barely turned, gave a short response, and dismissed him with a small gesture. At that point, nothing was getting through anymore. Around her, the entire market began to shift. Awnings were folded up, tables pulled inward, and items moved back just enough to clear the train's path. Everything happened quickly and in sync, like a routine done hundreds of times. And, to me, that's the biggest warning sign. Not the horn, not the shouting, but the way everything around her was already preparing for something she chose to ignore. She checked her screen and frowned. It wasn't the shot she had in mind. Instead of stepping back with everyone else, she adjusted again, focused on getting it right. Instead of stepping back with everyone else, she took a small step forward to widen her shot. It didn't look like much, but it removed the little space she had left to recover. People called out louder. Someone even reached for her arm. But she pulled away, repositioned herself, and planted her feet even closer to the rail. By then, while everyone else pressed fully against the stalls, she stayed slightly off the wall, leaving herself in the train's path. When the horn sounded, it echoed through the narrow corridor of stalls, and everyone else reacted instantly, pressing themselves against walls and tables to make space. The area tightened, leaving almost no room between the train and the structures. But Susan leaned slightly forward instead, still focused on her screen. From her perspective, it all felt controlled, like she knew exactly how close she could get. As the train moved through and the space narrowed to inches, Susan didn't move. The side of the train brushed into her upper body in a glancing hit, not enough to stop it, but enough to throw her off balance. Her body twisted sharply, and because she was already too close to the rail, there was no space left to step back or catch herself. It knocked her off balance and twisted her sideways. About 3 feet away was the corner of a stall support beam, rigid and positioned at head height. When she fell, her head struck that edge with full force. The impact was immediate. Her phone flew from her hand and skidded across the ground. As she collapsed before the train had even fully passed, people rushed to her within seconds. She was still breathing, but there was no response, and one of her eyes had already fixed in place. Emergency responders arrived minutes later and began treatment, but her condition didn't change. She never regained consciousness. What actually killed her wasn't the train itself. The impact caused severe head trauma and rapid internal bleeding. Within minutes, the damage was beyond recovery. The train was just the trigger. The fall and exactly where she landed was what made it fatal. Later that day, the market reopened. The stalls went back into position. The tracks were cleared, and everything returned to the same routine as before.
It was September 11th, 2017. Tropical storm Irma had already torn through the Florida Keys and was pushing a slow, heavy surge toward Miami Beach. By early evening, the sky above Collins Avenue was a nasty gray-green. Rain was coming down sideways, and the streets were starting to flood. Vanessa Parson, 48, had spent 20 years building a highly successful business sourcing limited edition luxury luggage and rare designer goods for wealthy clients. She was sharp, had incredible instincts, and genuinely believed that how you traveled said everything about who you were. Her absolute prized possession was an $80,000 limited edition designer trunk. I'm not going to name the brand here for legal reasons, but trust me, it's one of those luxury labels where the luggage can cost more than a new car. The trunk was a massive brass-fitted box, and she had brought it to Miami for a client meeting. She checked into a boutique waterfront hotel that afternoon and parked her SUV in the underground garage, specifically to keep that expensive trunk out of the rain. Now, here is where things take a turn. The hotel staff warned everyone. The underground garage was a major flood risk if the storm surge got worse. Warnings were posted right by the elevators and stairs. By 7 p.m., the manager ordered the garage evacuated. Security footage showed a dozen guests running down, grabbing their stuff, and leaving within minutes, but not Vanessa. She didn't head down until about 14 minutes after the warning. By the time she got under, the power had failed. Infrared security footage caught 2 hotel employees gesturing wildly for her to turn around and get out. They didn't physically stop her, though. The water was already up to her knees when Vanessa opened the back of her SUV and started dragging the trunk toward the exit ramp. Now, keep in mind, this trunk weighed nearly 90 pounds empty, and it definitely didn't have wheels made for swimming. She had to keep stopping just to fix her grip as the water kept rising. This is really a frustrating case for me. No piece of luggage, no matter how rare, is worth your life. Then another powerful surge of floodwater rushed into the garage from the street-level drainage system. The current slammed into parked vehicles, sending floating debris and loose objects tumbling through the water. Vanessa finally abandoned the trunk and tried to move toward the stairwell, but by then, the conditions had changed completely. The water rose from waist level to chest level within moments. Witnesses said she struggled to keep her footing as the current pushed her sideways across the slick concrete floor. At one point, she collided with the side of a parked vehicle and disappeared briefly behind a row of SUVs. Investigators later determined that Vanessa was likely swept into a deeper section of the garage where floodwater was circulating around the support columns and parked vehicles. In the darkness, with debris moving around her and visibility reduced to almost nothing, she became disoriented and unable to reach higher ground before the lower level filled further. Hotel staff called 911 when they realized someone was missing in the flooded garage. Fire crews arrived within minutes, but rising water and poor visibility delayed entry. Vanessa was found near her SUV and could not be revived. The medical examiner ruled the death an accidental drowning. Investigators concluded she repeatedly tried to retrieve the luxury trunk instead of evacuating, while bruising on her hands and forearms indicated she had struggled against the floodwater. It's just a heartbreaking, senseless tragedy. The hotel has since installed automatic flood barriers to make sure this never happens again. For me, this case is a harsh, unforgettable reminder that when nature forces an evacuation, you have to leave your stuff behind. Objects can be replaced. You can't. Vanessa held onto a trunk until the water took her. And what gets you about all of these is the same thing every time, not the accidents themselves, but the exact moment where turning back was still possible, and they didn't.